Good morning, folks. Welcome to CSIS and to the Transnational Threats Project event, Foreign Fighter Fallout. Let me first point out our emergency exits. We can, I believe, exit through the back here to a staircase out here, to a staircase directly in the back left, and then there's the large staircase that many of you may have come up to join us today. And also look for my team, Zach Fellman, if you can raise your hand, out in the back there, Maria Galper, and those two will lead you to safety. But hopefully we won't have a problem here. My name is Tom Sanderson. I serve as Director of the Transnational Threats Project. I've been here at CSIS for 15 years. It's a fantastic institution, and always happy to welcome you here and discuss some of these important issues. TNT, the Transnational Threats Project, covers terrorism, insurgency, and organized crime. We look at the intersection of those issues. We conduct a tremendous amount of field work overseas, 70 countries at this point. We're heading off soon to a number of countries to continue the work that we are covering here today. We bring that work back, and we bring those perspectives back from the wide spectrum of interviewees with which we engage, and we bring that and put it in front of the intelligence community, in front of policymakers, in front of warfighters, in front of CT, counterterrorism practitioners, in front of the media, in front of the public and the private sector. So we try to bring uniquely sourced perspectives back to a range of individuals and audiences. Today's event will feature comments by and an interview with Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, to be followed by an expert panel. I hope you can stay around with that, on groups in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. And that will be the subject of our engagement today. An accurate counting of foreign fighters is just not possible, but various official estimates exceed 40,000 fighters from more than 120 countries over the past 5 years of fighting in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. The factors pushing and pulling volunteers to the battle are numerous and specific to the individual. But more important than numbers are capabilities, intentions, and the impact on others. Many fighters have honed urban combat skills. They can miniaturize bombs, operate sniper rifles, raise money, coordinate operations, network, and recruit. And they have tremendous street credibility and legitimacy when they go back home. Many have a newfound sense of purpose, and they are now being pushed out of territory that they deem sacred, or that someone has told them is sacred. That their skill set and their mindset pose a threat to military and civilian targets across the world is the reality that is upon us today. To better understand the nature of this threat, our TNT team here, in cooperation with the CSIS Middle East program, undertook research on the various elements of the foreign fighter threat. Completed work that you can view today on the CSIS Foreign Fighter website, which is foreignfighters.csis.org, includes a chapter on the role of foreign fighters in previous conflicts, authorized by Maria Galper and Donnelly, an in-depth examination of Tunisia, authored by our Middle East program colleagues Hai Malka and Margot Balboni, from whom you'll hear later this morning, and a look ahead at the implications of foreign fighters, authored by my colleague Zach Fellman. Additional modules will appear on the site as we complete and undertake work across the Levant, Russia, Europe, and Southeast Asia throughout this year and next. Fieldwork for this effort took place across several countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Let me take a moment here to thank other members of the CSIS team who played important roles in bringing this together: Hannah Werman, Natalia Pena, Jessica DePaulo, Gulia Toleganova, Debbie Stroman, Kathleen Tiley, Jake Lippincott, Jim Dunton, and the iLab team. We've seen a lot of progress against the Islamic State over the past year or more, but as we know, some of the keys to success include durable socioeconomic development and political reform. Neither is in sight. And though 60,000 fighters have been killed by counter-ISIS forces on the field, we have a dispersed ISIS and a still potent al-Qaeda network to reckon with, and we may even see something of a reconciliation between the two groups. These developments point not to a lessening of the foreign fighter threat, but possibly to a heightening of the danger posed by them. Bruce Hoffman, writing in the December 2016 issue of the West Point CTC Sentinel, notes that, quote, any kind of reconciliation between Islamic State and al-Qaeda or reamalgamation would profoundly change the current conflict and result in a significantly escalated threat of foreign fighter terrorist operations in the West. Suffice to say, as we make some progress on the military side of countering ISIS and al-Qaeda, we have a lot more to do to prevent a repeat of what we've seen over the past several years. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you one of the most important individuals in the effort to confront foreign fighters and terrorist groups more broadly, General Michael K. Nagata, Lieutenant General. Lieutenant General Michael K. Nagata assumed the position of Director of the Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning at the National Counterterrorism Center on May 13 of 2016. Previously, Lieutenant General Nagata served as the Commander Special Operations Command SOC at CENTCOM, a sub-unified command of CENTCOM from June 2013 to October 2015, a tremendously important time with regard to the subject at hand today. A native of Virginia, Lieutenant General Nagata graduated from Georgia State University and was commissioned as an infantry officer in 1982. Initially served as platoon leader in the 2nd Infantry Division before volunteering for Army Special Forces in 1984. Throughout his career, he served in various positions within Army Special Forces to include Detachment Commander, Executive Officer, Battalion S3, Operations Center Director, Battalion Executive Officer, Group Operations Officer. Later, he served as the commander of the 1st Battalion, 1st Special Warfare Training Group, responsible for the Special Forces Qualification Course. In 1990, General Nagata volunteered and assessed for a Special Missions Unit, in which he served at various times throughout his career as a Troop Commander, Operations Officer, Squadron Commander, and SMU Commander. After graduating from the National War College, Lieutenant General Nagata served in the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He then served within the intelligence community as a Deputy Director for Counterterrorism. As a general officer, he served as the Deputy Chief Office of Defense Representative to Pakistan, the Deputy Director of Special Ops and Counterterrorism, J37 of the Joint Staff, and Commander, SOCCENT. He has deployed extensively throughout his career, participating in contingency and combat operations in such varied locales as Somalia, the Balkans, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, and elsewhere. Lieutenant General Nagata is a graduate of the Infantry Officer Basic and Advanced Courses, United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College, and the United States National War College. Lieutenant General Nagata and his wife, Barbara, have 5 children who are the lights of their lives. With that, I turn it over the lectern to General Nagata for his remarks. General Nagata, thank you again for your service to our country and for your great partnership with us at CSIS.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, Tom, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you to CSIS for inviting me here. And particularly thank you for your forbearance. I am obviously late. The only excuse I will give you is that I think that one of the greatest threats to national security are traffic patterns in the Washington, D.C. area. But enough of that subject. I'm going to try to make my remarks here relatively brief. My experience in these fora are generally that the greatest value people can derive are getting a chance to ask people like me any questions you may have or challenge any assertions I may make from this podium. So let me just cover a few topics here as a way of priming the pump. As you've already heard, I am speaking here from my position in the National Counterterrorism Center. For those of you that are curious what a 3-star general does in the National Counterterrorism Center, I am responsible for what is essentially a strategy development and strategic assessment shop within the National Counterterrorism Center. In other words, we assist the United States government in formulating counterterrorism strategy, and we have a corresponding responsibility to assess whether or not those strategies are effective. And we're very busy doing both, as you might imagine. CT is a busy business. As you already know, the rise of the Islamic State, the foreign terrorist fighter threat that has been part and parcel of the rise of that organization, is occurring at a time. It has been occurring during a time. It is still occurring during a time of enormous geopolitical complexity and change. All you have to do is pick up the newspapers to realize that the Islamic State, ISIS, the threat that its foreign terrorist fighters pose is not the only strategic challenge the United States or the global community faces on the world stage. It is simply one of them. That makes confronting the Islamic State, that makes confronting the foreign terrorist fighter problem more difficult, because we have to be able to juggle more than one ball at the same time. The problem for the past 4 years, as Tom has already indicated, has been enormously complex in and of itself, but I'll just hit a few highlights here. as you've already heard, somewhere around 40,000 foreign terrorist fighters that the world has been able to identify so far. That number has inherent imprecision in it. So far, we think they have emanated, or we assess that they have emanated from at least 120 countries around the world. And it is probably the most ethnically diverse, sociologically diverse, non-monolithic, if that's a term, foreign fighter problem we have seen so far. Just the foreign terrorist fighter alone, understanding what it is comprised of, has been an enormously complex endeavor by both the intelligence community, other government and international actors, and civilian actors. Just identifying the nature and scope of the problem is unfinished work today. But it is, I think, inarguably the largest foreign terrorist fighter challenge the world has seen in the modern age. As I've already said, they're not monolithic. The motives that cause a man or woman to wish to travel from their homes, wherever that may be around the world, to join ISIS are incredibly diverse. There are probably some reasons we do not yet understand. We do know some simply come for the adventure. Some come to fight for ISIS for a variety of ideological reasons. There are a number of them. Some come because they are seeking to redress a grievance. Some believe, perhaps, that they can find the elusive item called justice by flocking to ISIS' banner. But as I've already said, I do not believe we actually know all of the motivations at this point. In terms of the world's approach to the foreign terrorist fighter problem, in my own view, there have been roughly 2 phases to the way the international community has grappled with this problem. The first phase, at the risk of oversimplifying this, was recognizing we had a problem. This began 4 years ago. That there was a foreign terrorist fighter component of the rise of ISIS. And the more we looked at it in those early days, the more troubling just the volume of indicators we had were. But how big was this problem? How many fighters were we talking about? In the early months, we simply did not know, but what we were seeing, what we did understand at the time, was pretty troubling. And as we now know, we have counted, recognizing the count is imprecise, the largest amalgamation of foreign terrorist fighters in a condensed period of time that we have ever seen, at least certainly in my 30 years of working on counterterrorism, unlike anything I've ever seen. And that caused us to ask the question, not just the United States, but internationally, the whole community was asking, how can this be? And perhaps just as importantly, at the mechanical level, how can so many people have traveled for this purpose successfully without the world being able to stop them? And it caused the international community to realize that we had enormous inconsistency around the global landscape about whether or not deciding to travel to join the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was a criminal activity. The good news is that in, I think it was September of 2014, a new United Nations Security Council resolution was passed, 2178, that recognized the problem and that urged all nation states to act against this problem, perhaps most importantly, in making it a criminal activity. Now, did that stop the flow of foreign fighters? No, it did not. But just the fact that the world decided to make it a crime was a very important step in the right direction. I think if you had asked me 2 years ago what our biggest problem was, 3 years ago really, it would have been that we have to make this activity a criminal action, no matter where you are in the world. Now that we have taken that step, we have moved into what I would call the second phase of the world's struggle against the foreign terrorist fighter problem. Now, I'm going to be very brief about this, but I don't want to oversimplify this. What I'm about to suggest is not the only thing we have to do. There are many other things we have to do besides. But for me, the most vivid challenge we now face is ensuring that the information and intelligence about the travel, the plans, the intentions, and identities of foreign terrorist fighters are as broadly known as possible everywhere in the world, because their travel can be so unpredictable. And unsurprisingly, a foreign fighter seeks to mask his or her travel. They don't advertise the fact that they intend to go fight for ISIS. They try to hide within the otherwise very positive development of the free flow of people, goods, and services around the world. They take advantage of that. So getting information and intelligence about the plans, intentions, and travel of a foreign fighter is inherently difficult. But as we learned in our own country after 9/11, it's insufficient for one entity of a community to know a piece of information about a nefarious actor if that information is not shared with everyone else who has a stake in this. And that is the challenge the world now faces. If a law enforcement actor, an intelligence officer, a civil society member somewhere in the world believes they have information or intelligence about a potential foreign fighter, can that information be shared with the widest possible audience to increase the likelihood that someone along their route of travel can prevent them from reaching their destination? Have we gotten better at this? Yes, we have. Much of the work since the passing of the UN Security Council resolution has been towards this end, to improve and strengthen information sharing. We have made inarguable progress in many arenas. Is it good enough? No, it is not good enough, particularly when you consider the size, the quantity of this problem. Somewhere around 40,000, we think. That's a breathtaking number. Bringing it closer to home, let me make a few comments about what the United States government has been doing and continues to do to strengthen our own national ability, not only to deal with this problem ourselves, but to assist our allies and partners around the world in doing likewise. Much of what I'm about to say is going to probably sound pretty obvious to most of you, so I'll be brief about this. First of all, we had to address, as a government, and we are still addressing, how to ensure that every part of the United States government is contributing to this effort and contributing to it in a way that fosters coordination, integration, collaboration, and just simply good teamwork across all the departments and agencies of the United States government. If that sounds like an extension of the journey the U.S. government has been taking against terrorism ever since 9/11, that's because it is. It is simply an extension of that original journey, but now against the largest foreign terrorist fighter problem we've ever seen. We have made clear progress in this arena, but as I said earlier about the world's approach, is it good enough yet? Not yet. We are working on it. Secondly, we've had to adapt our thinking, both as a government and as an international coalition against the Islamic State, about the fact, unfortunately, that the very welcome defeat of ISIS's army-like capabilities in Iraq and Syria will not bring an end to the global terrorist attack threat that ISIS poses, including by the utilization of foreign fighters. We must defeat ISIS's army inside of Iraq and Syria. And we are well on the way to doing so, although it will take continued months of very serious effort to do that. But unfortunately, that military defeat of that military instrument does not end the foreign terrorist fighter threat. It does not eliminate ISIS' ability to inspire new recruits around the world. Unfortunately, that will continue. So we need to remind ourselves, and we have been reminding ourselves, that there is still so much more work yet to do, even after we have defeated its army. We also have had to recognize, and we are recognizing, that foreign terrorist fighters, the number of them, their identities, their nature, is not constrained, it's not confined to those who travel to Iraq and Syria. Unfortunately, there are people who leave their homes somewhere in the world to join a part of the Islamic State that is not in Iraq and Syria. It is related to the original problem, but it is different than the original problem. And we have to grapple with that as well. And then finally, I'll say we are working on something that isn't necessarily the strong suit of any government, but it is absolutely necessary. We have to be patient. We are not going to end this threat this year. I don't think we can identify a time horizon within which we will somehow contain and eliminate the ISIS-related foreign terrorist fighter problem. We can. If we do this properly, we will, but it will take years to solve this problem. If we try to pretend that we can solve it sooner than that, I think we're kidding ourselves. So this requires strategic patience. Hard for any government, but still necessary. All right, I told myself that I would not leave this podium without saying something uplifting and optimistic. I haven't managed to yet. So let me close before we go to questions by just saying this. As serious as this threat is, as large as the problem is, in some ways as unprecedented as this foreign terrorist fighter problem is, I had the privilege of attending the ministerial that was held here in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. And many of the foreign ministers of a very large proportion of the international coalition against ISIS were gathered. And I suppose there were probably some people who were observing this who were wondering if perhaps the world's patience or the world's stamina or the world's durability against what is inarguably a long-term problem might begin to dissipate because we can now see on the horizon the collapse of its army-like capabilities inside of Iraq and Syria. It hasn't happened yet, but you can see it on the horizon, whether it's in Mosul or Raqqa or elsewhere in the Levant. The coalition is going to defeat the army of ISIS. And I suppose there were some people wondering, are we going to take our foot off the gas too soon? Are we going to declare it over when in fact it is not over, not just because of the foreign terrorist fighter problem, but because of many of the other aspects of ISIS that cannot be defeated militarily. And I'm happy to report that I saw no evidence of that in the ministerial. In fact, what I saw was representatives of all the coalition nations actually reaffirming their commitment to stay together to deal with what is left of ISIS after their army is defeated. And that was a very encouraging sign. So, much work yet to do. We don't have the answer to every problem. I suppose all the places where I don't have answers, that's exactly where you'll ask me questions. But nonetheless, I'd be happy to ask any that you have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. That's it. Thank you. Just one moment. Excellent. Thank you very much, General Nagata. I appreciate your comments. And I know that we have a great crowd here today, and a lot of folks here that I know have experience in the realm of counterterrorism and international security on a number of levels. And so we'll jump to the questions. I have 6 here, but I'm just going to do one since we have such a good crowd today. Let me just jump right to one that has concerned us greatly, and I know has concerned the U.S. government and many others in the region, and that is Turkey. Now, the foreign fighter issue can't be discussed without mentioning Turkey and Turkey's role. They have accommodated a wide range of fighters as they have crossed the border into Syria, with very specific reasons for doing so, one of which the U.S. shared early on at a strategic level, bringing down the Assad regime. Late in 2015, and more significantly in 2016, Turkey starts to change its attitude towards the fighters, some of them, as they start to strike inside the country. How soon after the Syrian conflict did you think that the Turkey and U.S. disposition towards fighters changed? And where do we stand today with Ankara in this challenge of managing foreign fighters?
Let me start by saying that in my previous assignment as the commander of SOCCENT, I visited Ankara and particularly Turkish military forces, as you might guess, but also some of their political leadership pretty frequently. Despite the fact, as a military, as a Department of Defense matter, Turkey, as you know, lies in the European combatant commander's area of responsibility. General Breedlove at the time was very gracious in allowing me to constantly interact with my Turkish military colleagues because it's obviously so important, not just for the foreign terrorist fighter problem, but because of the challenge we face against ISIS both in Syria and Iraq. So I think I can say with some confidence that, unsurprisingly, because of the enormous loss of life in Turkey because of ISIS attacks of various types for several years now, they are passionate about ISIS. What happened before? What their attitudes may have been before about 2014, which is I think when I made my first trip there as the SOCCENT commander. I cannot speak to firsthand. What I saw in 2014 is because they were beginning to experience direct loss of life, direct casualties from ISIS attacks emanating out of Syria, is I saw a great deal of concern, a great deal of worry, and the beginnings of what you have seen in ensuing months, beyond simply clamping down on the travel of potential foreign terrorist fighters transiting through Turkey. All of you know by now, Turkish military forces have crossed the border into northern Syria. They've conducted their own series of operations to clear hundreds of kilometers along their border, push ISIS away from their own border. It's had the commensurate effect, or I'm sorry, it has had the corollary effect of making it exponentially more difficult, not impossible, but exponentially more difficult for a foreign terrorist fighter to cross in either direction the border of Turkey. That said, I saw it firsthand. I think I would have been able to at least articulate this even before I visited there. The Turkish border, southern Turkey, northern Syria, it's enormously complicated for historical reasons. Particularly, as everyone here, I think here knows, the unfortunate history between the ethnic Turks or Turkoman and the ethnic Kurds. That complexity has had an impact on both our own, the coalitions, and Turkish effectiveness against foreign terrorist fighters. So I guess what I'd say, to wrap it all up, is Turkey is demonstrating, in my opinion, an enormous amount of seriousness at preventing foreign fighters across their border. It is incredibly complicated, though. It is certainly not perfect. We know that foreign terrorist fighters can still find pathways to move across the Turkish border. It's just much harder for them than it used to be, and that's a good thing. And there's a history problem regarding Turkey and the border with Syria, as well as the border with Iraq, that is a complicating factor as well. And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, it's a fixed part of the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have 35 million people who come in every year as tourists, so
That's right.
It is hard to pick up all of them. Okay, folks, please state your name and your affiliation before you ask your question. And Gulia, if you can come up to the front here, this gentleman here. Thank you.
Michael Gordon, New York Times. General, following on your recent comments, what is the current foreign fighter flow to ISIS? What are the numbers you're seeing now? What is the reverse foreign fighter flow, and how is it being impeded by the Turkish military operations, SDF, et cetera, in northern Syria?
Right.
And then lastly, clearly ISIS must see the handwriting on the wall. They know they're going to lose Mosul. Some of their own leadership has left Raqqa. How are they planning to use foreign fighters after the fall of Mosul and Raqqa? Are they planning to have the volunteers stay in place in Europe and create mayhem there? Are they redirecting them elsewhere? How is their concept for using foreign fighters changing? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to see you. Let me stipulate up front, to get it out of the way, that I can give you very little precision about the rate of flow or the volume of flow. I think I can confidently say we know it's much less than it was. I have seen some statistics, but they're very general statistics, that perhaps we've reduced the flow in and out of Syria by more than half, but my confidence level in our precision is not terrific. We know we've damaged it. We know we've damaged it significantly. But having said that, when I recall for myself that we're talking about an aggregate of somewhere around 40,000, even if we have cut it in half, even if we've cut it by 2/3, that's still a very significant number of foreign terrorist fighters. Let me put it in a little bit of context. When I served in Iraq, I tried to track foreign fighters supporting AQI very closely. At the time, and this was during the surge, this was during the height of the fighting in Iraq, we were counting foreign fighters in the hundreds, not in the thousands. So the challenge we face, both in terms of measurements, but more importantly, in terms of taking action, this is a much larger problem. And this is a very different problem, as you already know. So we know we've damaged it, we know we've reduced it substantially, but we cannot provide ourselves, and I certainly can't provide you, a lot of precision. Because, as I've already indicated, it's hard to identify these people. They're trying very hard not to be identified, not to be counted. And our instruments for measuring, when you consider the chaos around Syria, Turkey doing the best it can, Lebanon doing the best it can, Iraq doing the best it can, Jordan doing the best it can, but if you want to hide, you can hide. If you want not to be counted, you can not to be counted. So imprecise. In terms of your second question, how will they use their foreign fighters? I think they will use them in all the ways you might imagine they will. But what's interesting to me about ISIS, as opposed to Al-Qaeda and other groups that preceded ISIS, I'm actually stealing a line a little bit from some of my FBI colleagues, which I agree with, where they say, one thing about these other organizations like Al-Qaeda is they really tried to give centralized direction to their foreign fighters. We want you to go here, we want you to do this. A lot of what comes out of ISIS is just go where you can and kill who you can. So it's less targeted in some ways, it's certainly less planned in some ways, but there's an inherent danger to this because it makes their use of foreign fighters more unpredictable because there's less central direction. But they will use them to commit acts of violence. They will use them to try to inspire others to join their ranks. All of these are predictable. We've seen these in other foreign fighter phenomenon over the years, but this decentralization problem is serious.
Great. Ed Soyster.
General, first of all, thanks for coming and sharing your experience with us. My question concerns training in the sense of how many have been some sort of training or military experience, combat experience in some other part that come, and then what kind of training do they get to try to pull together this very diverse group to an effective fighting force? Thank you.
Great question. Because it is such a diverse population coming to Iraq and Syria, or going elsewhere in the world, as I indicated in my opening remarks, some foreign fighters don't actually touch Iraq or Syria. But some have absolutely, many have no training whatsoever. They are simply assuming that they will receive it upon arrival. I suppose there are probably some young men, particularly, who are assuming they don't need it at all. They'll find out how wrong they are, but we don't. I'm unaware of any ability we've demonstrated to count who has training, who doesn't have training. It's kind of the same imprecision we suffer from, just in terms of counting numbers. I think it is safe to conclude. I think I can confidently conclude that, particularly in Iraq and Syria, ISIS' ability to train, organize, and equip these fighters upon their arrival has been significantly reduced because of all the damage we've inflicted, not just on those who would otherwise be training them, but because many of the trainers have been called to the front lines because of the casualties they've been taking. So there are fewer people to do the training. They need these bodies more urgently on the front lines than they used to. There was a time, as some of you may recall, this was widely reported journalistically, that they had established very elaborate training sites, very elaborate training programs, much harder for them to do now. In some places, it's become impossible for them to do. So their ability to train and prepare people to go into combat has been significantly reduced. I don't think it's been eliminated, but it's been significantly reduced. That said, when one considers the question of how sophisticated do you actually have to be if you manage to go elsewhere, you manage somehow to escape Iraq and Syria, or you never went there to begin with, and you've simply been told, kill who you can, where you can. How much training and preparation do you actually need? The answer, unfortunately, is not very much. Best example of that was the truck driver in Nice. He required a driver's license.
Yes, in the middle on this side, please.
Thank you. My name is Laurent Barthélemy from Agency France Press, news agency. I would like to know if you can characterize the size of the problem of foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria. How many are there now? Because I suppose that many have been killed.
Yes.
So can you give some kind of estimate?
Our ability, we have, as I'm sure you've seen in coalition reporting, a couple of months ago, I think now, the coalition confidently reported that we know we've killed in excess of 60,000 ISIS combatants in Iraq and Syria. We probably are getting close to 70,000 at this point. For all I know, we've crossed it. It's an astounding number. Unfortunately, our ability to distinguish whether it's through the combat actions of Iraqi forces, combat action of Syrian forces, coalition airstrikes, our ability to specifically identify when one of those actions has killed a foreign fighter versus someone who was born and raised in either Syria and Iraq is very limited. So that's a very long way, sir, of saying we really do not know. We know we have killed several thousand foreign terrorist fighters in Iraq and Syria, but I'm unable to give you a precise number. It's a substantial number, but this is another example of where precision remains elusive for us. But I say again, I remind myself, that when you start with a number of somewhere around 40,000, even if we assume we've killed, I'll just pick a number. Let's say we cannot, but let's say we could say we've killed 80% of them. That still leaves an enormous number of foreign terrorist fighters. And as unfortunately many of our governments have experienced, if an attack in a national capital somewhere in the world does not have to be conducted by 100 fighters, it can be conducted by a single person.
And remember, that single person coming back, or 2 or 3 people, are coming back with urban combat skills. Going against police forces, though well trained in major cities, are not police officers who were just in combat in Aleppo or something like that. So they have quite an impact. All the way in the back, please.
Hello.
My name is Margus Sonson. I'm DCM of the European Union delegation in Tajikistan. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Question from colleague to colleague. There is an information that there is a number of Tajik and Uzbek persons with Tajik and Uzbek ethnicity in ISIL institutions.
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't understand what you just said. What kind of persons?
As to our information, there are a number of people with different nationalities, and there are also people from Central Asian states, some with Tajik ethnicity, some with Uzbek ethnicity.
Right.
And also our latest information, there is also a question about ex-General Halimov, who should be in Mosul, and also with a small Tajik unit in order to also participating in these latest operations. But actually my question is about for the future, that in case things get too hot in Syria and Syria plus, so could we envisage relocation of some of the ISIL people to Afghanistan or some other countries next to Central Asia, and could we prognose any threats raising to Central Asian countries? So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think by now we should realize that ISIS' ability to export its ideology, its resources and people, and its intent to attack, they have demonstrated a global ability to do all of these things. And I think it would be a mistake for us to assume that they will not continue to do so. They will continue to do so. It's not, unfortunately, it's not completely dependent on their ability to have a foreign terrorist fighter move from Iraq or Syria to South Asia, to Central Asia, to Europe, to anywhere in the globe. It is an important instrument for them, but it's not the only instrument that's available to them. One of the things we've seen ISIS do, in my own view, with unprecedented effectiveness, is to radicalize someone who never leaves their home. Someone who never leaves their home, never leaves their country, but they become radicalized, usually online, but that's not the only way. They take up the cause of ISIS, and they become willing to die to commit an act of violence in their home. That is just as important as the problem of foreign terrorist fighters. Or this is actually an opportunity for me to say something that really doesn't flow from your question, but I do want to remind everyone that it's very important to realize that the problem of foreign terrorist fighters, urgent and important as that is not the only way that organizations like ISIS can create violence around the world. Global terrorist attacks and foreign terrorist fighters are not the same thing. Foreign terrorist fighters are a subset. They are a component of global terrorist attacks. But if somehow, through magic, we could eliminate all foreign fighters everywhere today, unfortunately, ISIS could still create acts of violence around the world.
Absolutely. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Melinda Carter from DOD. I had a question about the children of the foreign fighters. Are they accounted for in your numbers? And if they are being trained, whether it be on the ground in Iraq and Syria or virtually, and how is that in your research and planning? And if they go back, how easy that is for them to go back, and then what's the future for that?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, you're taking me out of my field of research. That's actually a question that I haven't considered. I should have by now, so thank you for asking me. I'll actually go back to my office and do a little research. So because it's not something I've studied very hard, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you a particularly satisfying question. We do know, you've seen it, ISIS has tried to create a propaganda-driven impression that all the children of ISIS fighters will take up the black flag, that they're ready now, even if they're only 11 or 12 years old, they're ready now to commit acts of violence. But we need to remember that's propaganda. There may be some truth to it, but it's probably not as strong or as ubiquitous as they are trying to convince us it is. But my guess would be that when you consider that I can only give you imprecise numbers about foreign terrorist fighters themselves, and we've got massive resources trying to do this counting, my guess would be we probably have little to spare to examine the question you're asking. So my hunch is, even if I had studied this, I'd probably still be giving you a disappointing answer. I don't think we really know. That's my guess.
In the panel that follows this, I think we can address the issue of some of the families who've come, especially from North Africa, to the battle space. And so if you're going to join us for that, I think we can cover families in general and maybe the children specifically. I think someone had their hand up over here. Yes, the gentleman in the middle.
Hi, Paul Henley, also from AFP. You've spoken about them as a force in the battlefield or out there, and as a threat. But can you give us a picture of the movement back to their homes, or movement away from the battlefield at this time? What are they doing? What are you intercepting? Or is this still more a potential threat and they're staying on the battlefield? And also, one last thing, what do you do with the foreign fighters who are captured on the battlefield?
Okay. Well, I'll take the last one first. The foreign terrorist fighter, pretty obviously international problem, coalition problem. And so what the coalition relies on, frankly, what the international community relies on, particularly in the wake of the UN Security Council resolution, and then what I did not mention in my prepared remarks, dozens of nations on the heels of the passage of the Security Council resolution enacted new laws in their own countries to criminalize foreign terrorist fighter travel, foreign terrorist fighter activity. So the world is primarily reliant on when a foreign terrorist fighter is apprehended in transit, before he or she leaves, when he or she comes back, whatever the case may be, to rely on either pre-existing or new laws that have criminalized this behavior, and into that country's judicial system these people go, assuming they have in fact been successfully detained. But I mean, there is no other answer than to use the judicial processes of the countries from which they have emanated, or if they're arrested in for them a foreign country, occasionally you'll see them prosecuted and some sort of consequence delivered while they are in a foreign country from the country of their birth. But predominantly it's, particularly if they've returned to their country, we're relying on their judicial system. And like I said, the good news is that in large measure across the world, this is now a crime. Whereas 4 years ago, in many countries, it was not. Your first question. I think all I can really tell you is, first of all, this is not a potential threat. This is a threat right now. There is latent potential in it, but it is a contemporary threat today. Not everywhere, but to certain countries, to certain populations, the foreign terrorist fighter threat is a threat today. In terms of the variations of outcomes, all I can do is tell you that it's probably the things you would imagine anyways. First of all, we see some foreign terrorist fighters deliberately dispatched by ISIS for specific activities around the world, some of which we have been able to detect and thwart. Unfortunately, are there probably things that they've directed foreign terrorist fighters to do that the international community has not been able to detect? Probably. But I can't prove a negative. there's ample opportunity for them to direct the activities of foreign terrorist fighter and travel that I'm sure there's some that escape our notice. Some are simply escaping to save their lives because they can see the imminent defeat of the army of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So they're acting in their own self-interest. They're acting to survive. In fact, they're breaking faith with their comrades, but they'd rather survive. But that begs the question, what will they do? And the answer is, if we look at the historical record away from ISIS, it's probably true that most of them will not commit acts of violence when they go home, but you certainly cannot dismiss the possibility that some of them will seek to commit acts of violence. Even though they acted to save their skin by fleeing Iraq and Syria, there's still a latent desire to wreak havoc, and they'll find an outlet for that. There are others who have been ideologically disappointed. They're not fleeing to save their lives. They've just discovered that ISIS is not what it purported to be. And they're so disappointed, they leave. But they're not leaving to survive, they're leaving because of disappointment. There are others as well. But again, ISIS and the foreign terrorist fighter problem is not a monolith. It is an incredibly diverse set of actors with incredibly diverse motivations.
Great. Do we have time for one more? Okay. Ma'am, you had one in the middle. Yeah, go ahead. And then we have one more after that. Okay, great.
I'm Dana Hansen, a contractor at State Department. What is the U.S. government doing to equip partner security forces to address some of the more grievances and long-term issues that breed instability and radicalization?
Great question. I wish I had the rest of the day to answer it because it would take that long. Unsurprisingly, both our own government and governments around the world are seeking to eliminate, I'll use the term that is often used, even though it's an imperfect term, the root causes, the drivers that lead to a foreign terrorist fighter problem itself, ISIS as a phenomenon. But I mean, I probably do not need to tell you that just achieving consensus, global consensus, about what the drivers of extremism actually are, how they may differ in terms of content and costume and texture, whether it's different in Asia than it is in Europe, it's different in Europe than it is in Americas. These are all different cultures, different populations. So this has been a very complex journey to try to achieve sufficient commonality, sufficient consensus, sufficient sophistication, depending on the locale, depending on the population, depending on the society they emanate from. What is it that causes a man or woman, a group of individuals, to choose the path of extremism, to choose the path of radicalization? We know a lot more than we did several decades ago, but I don't think I know anyone in this profession, in this arena of trying to prevent radicalization, that would claim we completely understand why human beings become extremists, why people take on radicalization to violence characteristics. And because that is unfinished, our work against it is unfinished. There's an enormous amount of activity against it, but obviously, given the size of the foreign terrorist fighter problem, the size of ISIS, which has exploded on the world stage in 2013 and 2014, we clearly don't have it figured out yet.
All the way in the back for the final question.
I'm Yahya Barzunji from Voice of America, the Qudus Service. Most of the country, they fight ISIS. But all the time, I wondering about one question. Who's supporting ISIS financially?
Many people and many actors, many organizations, many societies. That's probably an unsatisfying answer. But First of all, ISIS supports itself. ISIS, in my judgment, my personal experience, has been the most successful terrorist organization at generating revenue that I've ever seen. Probably most well known was their takeover of oil fields and natural gas sources inside of Syria. They made significant profit on that. We have significantly reduced their ability to do so. We haven't completely eliminated it, but it has been significantly damaged. There are other sources. They use extortion, they use hostage-taking. These are all familiar to this audience. Terrorists have been doing this since time immemorial. They take advantage of local corruption. Again, a time-honored tactic by extremists around the world. But I think it's important to remember that terrorism, unfortunately, is not expensive. I've been asked in other fora, why are they able to sustain this tempo of attacks around the world when we've taken so much money away from them? Unfortunately, the answer, I think, is because terrorism is cheap. It doesn't take a lot of money. We do need to attack their money. We do need to take as much of their finances away from them as we possibly can. But, you know, just as with everything else in life, there's no magic instrument for defeating ISIS. Taking away their money just by itself is insufficient. It's necessary, but it is insufficient. Just like defeating their army in Iraq and Syria is necessary and going to happen, but it won't stop global terrorist attacks. So I would encourage all of you, since this is my last question, I apologize for deviating somewhat from your question here. Please remember that whether it's the foreign terrorist fighter problem itself or ISIS more broadly, there's no single formula, there's no single action, there's no single success that wipes this scourge from the planet. It takes an almost bewildering number of activities, a diverse set of activities, some that only governments can do, some that only civil society can do, and we shouldn't confuse the two. But this is a world problem, and the only way the world is going to solve it is if the entire world engages in it. If the people that deal with finances don't work on it, if the people that deal with their military capabilities don't work on it, if the people that don't try to contest their use of propaganda don't work on it, and dozens of other things besides, we will live with this scourge for far too long. We already have. But thank you for your question. And thank you for listening to me.
Great, thank you very much. Folks, before I formally thank General Nagata, please, we'll have about a 5-minute break or so before the panel. We have 3 excellent experts on regional issues related to the foreign fighter threat, and there are bathrooms out to the right, but the General will exit to the rear. But let me just say, General Nagata, to finish on such a great point, understanding the multidimensional nature of approaching this threat of terrorism and of foreign fighters is a lifelong enterprise. Unfortunately, Tony Cordesman here at CSIS likes to say, doesn't like to say, but he says, that this is, don't expect an end to the violence, but an evolution of the violence. Right. And you're right to point out it takes more than military. It's socioeconomic. It's so many elements that must be brought to bear, and we've got quite a job ahead of us. Thank you so much, and to your team, and for all those who are confronting this threat today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's all right, no problem. No, that's fine. Yeah. I said hello.
Folks outside, if you could please come on in and join us so we can start the event. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Welcome back to Foreign Fighter Fallout. It's great to have General Nagata here to make comments. We have a superb panel with us to look at this issue from a regional perspective, but also beyond just a regional perspective. We are running a little bit behind time, so we're going to jump right into it. We'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll go right into their remarks and then into a Q&A session. Starting on my right, first will be Hai Malka, and then Aaron Zelen and Prashant at the end to cover Southeast Asia for us. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in with Hai Malka from the CSIS Middle East program, who joined me on a field visit to Tunisia, a place that Haim knows extremely well. And I'd love to hear your perspective on Tunisia as well as the foreign fighter threat across North Africa and beyond.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. It was an interesting experience that we had, and I learned a lot from the project. I also want to thank my colleague, Margot Balboni, who should actually also be sitting up here. She's a fantastic young researcher, and the project on Tunisia, the Tunisia chapter, would not have been a fraction of what it was without Margot's dedication and hard work and meticulous research. So I want to thank you, Margot. You know, the U.S. government, U.S. allies, the analytic community, we've been dealing with the foreign fighter phenomenon for a long time, for decades, since the Arab-Afghan problem in the early 1980s. We've seen the problem in Chechnya, in Mali, in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and each phase, each iteration gets bigger, gets more complex, and gets deadlier. I think part of the problem is that our approach is we see foreign fighters in a vacuum. We see the threat in a vacuum rather than part of a larger set of problems facing the regions. So this project, I think, has tried to identify some of the larger problems that feed into the foreign fighter threat, like the source countries, the transit countries, and trying to get a deeper understanding of the drivers of radicalization. What I want to do first is just highlight a couple of themes and lessons that I took from this project, and then speak more specifically about how those lessons apply to Tunisia and what we can learn from Tunisia's experience. I think the first lesson that we need to keep in mind when we are trying to address the foreign fighter threat is that the foreign fighter phenomenon is a symptom of a deeper problem of radicalization in source countries that are driven by a complex combination of political, social, economic, personal factors that essentially deny any kind of meaningful opportunity for young people to participate in their societies. And when you combine those factors with unmet expectations and frustration, it creates a violent and radicalized group of individuals that want to escape their current context and their reality and use violence against the state. So the civil wars, the conflict zones, the weak governments, are the ones that are providing the host environment for the foreign fighters. And I don't want to minimize that threat in Syria, in Iraq, and Libya, but it's the problems in the source countries that are driving the flow of foreign fighters to these battle zones. The second lesson is that military and counterterrorism efforts are obviously a necessary component of combating foreign fighters, and we heard that from General Nagata this morning. But military operations, counterterrorism, doesn't address the roots of the problem. The US launched more than 500 attacks against the ISIS holdout or headquarters in Sirte, Libya. It pushed ISIS out of Sirte, but we still see that the problem of ISIS exists in Libya, and the broader problem of jihadi Salafism still remains a threat in Libya. And as the US continues to push out ISIS from Raqqa and Mosul, we'll see the threat evolve in new ways outside of those strongholds. Third is that the problem of returning fighters, which is the next phase of the foreign fighter problem, cannot be addressed solely by law enforcement and incarceration, but has to include some kind of rehabilitation and dialogue with prisoners and fighters that have returned or other radicalized individuals. The prisons, as we've all come to understand, are the incubators of radicalism, of jihadi Salafism, and what happens is that those who are incarcerated often end up on the street at some point in the future and are more networked, more committed to the cause, and have greater capabilities once they're released. And then finally, the answer to radicalization, the answer to the foreign fighter problem, the answer to jihadi Salafism isn't about better messaging or combating the narrative of ISIS or Daesh. It's about changing the context that drives radical ideology and radical activity. So it's about improving jobs, civic participation, education, religious instruction and dialogue, decentralization of governments, creating infrastructure. All of this has to be done in the source countries that are creating or providing the foreign fighters. The military component, the CT, the law enforcement has its place, but if we're going to deal with the root of the problem, we have to think about the conditions and the context in the source countries. And this is a long-term generational effort, as we heard General Nagata talk about this morning. I want to get to Tunisia very briefly because I think Tunisia illustrates a lot of these lessons, and Tunisia is a frontline state both in the fight against radicalism, jihadi Salafism, and in dealing with the foreign fighter phenomenon as fighters return to Tunisia. Tunisia gets a lot of attention on the foreign fighter issue, and lots of people will claim that Tunisia is the largest single source of foreign fighters. I think it's a little unfair. Quite frankly, it's hard to prove that. I think the Tunisian government has been quite transparent and open with the figures that they're providing, while other governments in the Middle East and North Africa have been less transparent with the figures that they're sharing. So we get sort of a skewed view of Tunisia. Tunisia certainly has a problem, but I don't think it's fair to say that they're the single largest source of foreign fighters. What I think is important in Tunisia is that Tunisia is fighting terrorism and radicalization while also trying to democratize and transition to a new political system based on representative government, responsive government, transparency, and move away from the authoritarian system that Tunisia had for so many decades. That is not something to be taken lightly. None of the other countries in North Africa or the Middle East are fighting terrorism in the same way that Tunisia is, while also trying to make a transition to a more representative type of government. There's lots of debates in Tunisia about human rights, about prison reform, about incarceration, and I think we need to keep an eye on those debates in Tunisia and support them. I think Tunisia also provides a lot of useful insights and lessons into the problem and will be a test case for how governments address the problem, not only of local radicalization, but also of the return of foreign fighters. They've improved their CT capabilities dramatically over the past few years in a relatively short period of time. They've been able to adjust and improve law enforcement, intelligence, border security, and that's important, and we should be supportive of that. They're also piloting different programs in terms of prison rehabilitation and prison dialogue. It's just at the very beginning phases, but they're trying to understand and have a dialogue with prisoners to understand what has motivated people to leave Tunisia and join the fights in Syria and Libya. They're also piloting efforts to have an NGO or civil society-based outreach program to different vulnerable communities within Tunisia. They don't see the government as particularly well equipped to reach out to vulnerable communities, so they're using the NGO community to do some of that outreach and to dialogue with vulnerable populations. So we should be looking at Tunisia's experiences. We should be trying to see how the lessons that they're learning can be applied to other countries in the region and how we can learn more about that. So do I get a couple more minutes here?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. So what should we be watching in Tunisia now? About 800 fighters have returned to Tunisia according to Tunisian government sources. That's the number that they're putting out. About 200 of those are currently in prison. About 100 or so are under house arrest. And it's very difficult to monitor the rest of them. So Tunisia is not only grappling with the return of fighters on a large scale, but also dealing with an internal threat of locally radicalized individuals. They're dealing with the border threats from an al-Qaeda-linked insurgency on the western border with Algeria, plus the fallout from Libya and the threat of ISIS and other militant groups in Libya crossing the border. So really Tunisia is dealing with the intersection of multiple different threats at the same time. One of the lessons that we should learn from Tunisia's past experience with dealing with the foreign fighter threat is that the prisoners who are incarcerated eventually get out. They revive their old networks. They attract new followers. In prison, they've been able to hone their ideology. And that suppressing religious voices makes it more difficult to combat the religious component of Daesh's narrative. Tunisia's been through all of this before. They imprisoned people after 2011, and those people that they imprisoned were eventually released in 2000. They were incarcerated after 2001, and after 2011, they were released and became the leaders of the new generation of the Jihadi Salafi movement, of al-Qaeda-linked groups, and eventually ISIS and Daesh-linked groups. So focusing on that prison element, focusing on how you deal with people that have been incarcerated, and trying to figure out how to divide those who are in prison, who have participated in some way in the foreign fighter phenomenon or have been radicalized, trying to figure out which of those are irredeemable, who hold to their ideology and to violence against civilians or the state, and which can be potentially rehabilitated is a really important test for Tunisia's stability and for North Africa and the Middle East more broadly. So right now, Tunisia is developing several important initiatives. One is a counterterrorism strategy that focuses on prevention, protection, security, and prosecution. It's sort of like the U.S. national security strategy, which is a long list, a to-do list. It's the beginning. They're in the first early stages of figuring this out, but they are making an effort to tackle this problem in a more comprehensive way. The second part of their strategy is a platform to combat radicalization. And here they're working more on prison reform and trying to understand what motivates radicalized individuals, as well as targeting the younger population. Almost 40% of the country's population is under the age of 25. So they really see this as a long-term struggle, and they're talking about their 2030 plan. They don't see this as something that they're going to be able to finish and wrap up and fix in the next 5 years. This is a long-term plan. What I think is interesting and missing from the Tunisian efforts is to have some kind of a religious dialogue component. All of Tunisia's neighbors at some point in the last 20 years have included a religious dialogue program in their efforts to understand the problem of radicalization. And that has had mixed results. but I think it's an important component of any kind of process of understanding and combating the problem. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I'll just leave you with the thought that the U.S. military can destroy the physical location, the physical battle space, or the physical caliphate in Raqqa or Mosul or Sirte, and eliminate the foreign fighters. But if we don't work with the source countries to address the problems that drive foreign fighters, that drive jihadi Salafism, that drive radicalization, we're going to be having this conversation over and over and over again. And at some point in the future, we're going to see a new incarnation of ISIS that could be much deadlier. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Haim. And let me just remind you, as I mentioned in my opening remarks before General Nagata spoke, that the great work that Haim and Margot did is on the website at foreignfighters.csis.org. And I encourage you to look at it. It is incredibly detailed with information on how individual fighters made it to the battlefield, their backgrounds, et cetera, and it was quite extraordinary. And I'll just note that when we were there in late 2015, I did have the chance to interview the parents of a fallen foreign fighter, a Tunisian who had gone to battle in Iraq. And he was one of 5 children. He was only one of those 5 children was employed. They were recruited outside of, he and his brother recruited outside of a mosque in their town. And among the many other issues that Haim has mentioned, of course, economic opportunity is one issue, but many, many others that are there. Aaron, you've covered North Africa quite a bit, as well as Syria. We'd love to hear from you now.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I'd also like to thank CSIS for inviting me to this event today. Tom was most interested in me talking a little bit about Europe and the angle related to foreign fighters in Europe, so I'm going to talk about that. The reality is that we're already about 3 to 4 years into the returnees of foreign fighters from Iraq and Syria into Europe. If you'll recall, the first attack was in, I believe, April or May 2014 against the Jewish museum in Brussels, Mahdi Namouche. So the reality is that this is nothing new. This has already been going on for many years. In addition to that, one of the things we saw in around the 2014 period was that ISIS started seeding individuals and networks that had been training or gaining experiences in Iraq and Syria to places like Libya, to places like Southeast Asia, as you'll be talking about, as well as others. So I think, we need to stop talking about stuff that's already been going on. We need to be looking forward to what's going to happen in the future and where ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other groups might be seeding individuals or networks in the future, and how that might play out. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what's been going on in Western and Northern Europe, Scandinavia, just because it's been in the news so much, whether it's in terms of the attacks that have happened in France or Germany, or even most recently in the UK, or some of the different efforts being put into place related to the so-called countering violent extremism programs, CVE, with prevention as well as rehabilitation, reintegration. I would say in terms of the areas that have gotten less attention that should be focused on more is related to places where some of the foreign fighters were going through to get into Turkey, but also that then went into Syria, but then from Turkey back into Europe. And some of these also related to the migrant and refugee flows. It's important to note that migrants and refugees in of themselves are not terrorists, they're not extremists, but jihadi groups will take advantage of these flows because this is how people travel, and we've already seen that, especially with the case of the Paris attacks in November 2015. So I just wanted to note that one of the things that I worry about, especially as we've seen arrests, is places in Eastern Europe like Poland or Hungary, or places in the Balkans, which might not have had to deal with these issues in the past, such as in Romania or Bulgaria. So one of the things I think that needs to be understood, and that we've seen in the past in relation to how networks are created as well as how future foreign fighter flows are established, is what's going on within these flows, whether it was after the anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s and early 1990s, and individuals going into Europe then because they couldn't go back to their home countries due to the policies of the government, especially in North Africa, or even more recently. So I think that that is the basis for figuring out where these future networks are going to lay and where they'll take advantage of, especially in countries that are not necessarily equipped or have experience with it, especially the ones that I mentioned. So I would say that that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is, besides those that are already within this movement, is that they might then try and recruit locally those from those host nations or those countries that they're then living in, and therefore radicalizing these individuals. And one of the things that we see, at least in the Western context, which really can't be discussed when you're talking about the Middle East and North Africa or even Southeast Asia, is the issue of converts. About 35 to 50% of individuals involved in foreign fighting in Western Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, it depends which country you're talking about, are converts. So that's another aspect we need to talk about too, especially in many of these, heritage Christian or post-Christian societies, or however you want to describe it, where people might not feel that they have any meaning in their life, and therefore, if there's some tragedy or grievance in their life, then these individuals that are within ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some other group could then prey upon them, as we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. Related to this is the funding of Salafi mosques in some of these new communities that will be popping up, I think, in Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Of course, in of itself, there's nothing wrong with Salafism, but there is the violent trend within it, which we know about, which is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the reality is some of these mosques then create communities that then lead to radicalization, which we have seen. And one aspect I think is most important is the proselytization efforts. If you look at the foreign fighter flows from Western Europe in Iraq and Syria over the last 5 years, many of the individuals who have gotten involved are those who were involved in these jihadi proselytization movements, whether it's Al-Muhajirun in the UK, whether it was for St. Eliza in France, whether it was Sharia for Belgium, Sharia for Holland, whether it was Dawa FFM in Germany or Milatu Ibrahim in Germany. These are the basis of future networks. And therefore, I think it's very important that these governments that have never had to deal with this issue need to understand that while these individuals might be proselytizing nonviolently at the time, because of their ideology, if there's something that could fill that vacuum in the future with the future foreign fighter flow, that is something that needs to be watched out for. And then lastly, something that I think many people are not really paying attention to, while we're so focused on the Levant and what's going on there, I would say another aspect of the migration flow that is relevant, that also has a basis for jihadi activism and safe haven or foreign fighter flows that not many people are talking about, is the sort of Libyan, Malian network and those people involved there. For the first time, we've really seen West Africans getting involved within the jihadi movement. And one of the things that we've seen, while many people have talked about the migration and refugee flows from the Levant, the reality is a good portion of individuals are also migrating or refugees from parts of Africa. And we've seen that jihadis are taking advantage of these routes as well. So then the question is what are the connections then that go back between those who might be involved in these movements in Europe and then back in their own home countries? One of the interesting things we saw with the attack of Anas Amiri in Germany was that he was actually talking with people inside of Libya while planning the attack. I suspect that similar types of things will happen in the future, and not just redirecting between networks in Europe and Iraq and Syria, but also networks in Europe in Libya, or probably more likely now, because Libya has been cleared in some ways, but probably more Mali in some respects now. So I'll just leave it at there, since it's a lot to chew on, I know, in a short amount of time. So thanks again.
Great, thank you, Aaron. That reminds me to note to the crowd that we conducted with our Africa program here at CSIS a study on militant movements in West Africa. That included fieldwork in Mali and Niger, northeast Nigeria and Maiduguri, and also in Senegal. And I encourage you to check that out on the CSIS website as well. Prasanth, you are a CSIS alumni. Glad to have you back. You grew up in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore, and you bring an excellent perspective on Southeast Asia. So please offer your ideas on the returning fighter threat to Southeast Asia, as well as those who made it to the battlefield, motivations, and anything you'd like to offer to us.
Great. Thanks to Tom and to CSIS. It's great to be back, always great to be back. not the most enlightening, most optimistic of topics, but nonetheless, I'll try to indulge. I just actually got back from a trip when I was in Southeast Asia. I was in the Philippines, starting off, and then I was also in Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand. And I think it's safe to say in all four of these countries, the Islamic State, well, next to the Trump administration and what we might see in terms of U.S. policy, I think the Islamic State was the most direct and immediate concern for all of these countries, and with good reason. I think suffice to say that, as Haim correctly pointed out, and as Lieutenant General Nagata very eloquently said in his remarks, the terrorism and radicalization problem is something that recurs, and a lot of us have been studying this for decades. We'll note that this is something that recurs over time. There are patterns, similar challenges, and a lot of the individuals sometimes move from group to group, even though the group orientation may change over time. But nonetheless, the Islamic State, I think, presents a particularly potent and serious threat for Southeast Asia. I think the biggest sense here, if you look at it geographically, there are four main countries involved in Southeast Asia. It's Malaysia, Indonesia, and Malaysia and Indonesia are the two big Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia. And then you have Singapore and the Philippines. These are kind of the four main countries. There was a major attack in Thailand back in 2015 that put a lot of attention to that country. And there's been some noise around Myanmar as well in terms of some of the Rohingya violence there. But I would say these are the four big countries that are involved. And I think the sense in all four of these countries is that the nature of the threat is rising quickly in spite of the fact that the state responses have actually been quite robust. In terms of the numbers, if you look at them, from Southeast Asia, there are about 600 to 900 individuals who have entered Syria and Iraq since 2013. There were a number of individuals who were there beforehand, in actual fact, but most of them entered after 2013. The state responses in terms of restricting these flows has been quite effective at stemming them, particularly since 2016, but these individuals have found various creative routes, if you will, to get to Syria and Iraq nonetheless. So the flow is continuing into these countries. The interesting thing about Southeast Asia and its place in the Islamic State is that the Islamic State has actually poured a lot of attention and resources into cultivating Southeast Asia as a major center and potential hub for its operations. So there is actually a dedicated unit within the Islamic State called Katiba Nusantara, which houses sort of the Malay fighters, so mostly from Malaysia and Indonesia, but also some individuals from Singapore and the Philippines as well. And beyond the fact that there is a dedicated unit, some of the propaganda efforts that the Islamic State has advanced are published specifically in Bahasa Malaysia and Bahasa Indonesia, the languages in Malaysia and Indonesia. So you can tell, I mean, there is a significant effort on the part of the Islamic State to cultivate Southeast Asia in this sense. In terms of the distribution and the nature of the flow of fighters, it's risen quite quickly relative to some of the previous waves we've seen in the past. So in the 1980s, for example, you saw hundreds of Southeast Asians go initially to Pakistan and then into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. But this time, it's a little bit different in a number of ways. One, if you talk to the governments, what they'll say is that these individuals are now taking their families to Syria and Iraq. Creates a potentially bigger problem once they plan to come back, because the rehabilitation and reintegration effort, which Haim talked about earlier, is going to be more significant because you're talking about families being reintegrated as opposed to individuals. And these individuals are now going and, compared to the previous wave in Afghanistan, where some of them sometimes stayed in Pakistan and weren't actually involved in the fighting, these individuals actually are quite involved. And many of them have actually died in battle already. In terms of the gravity of the threat, all four of the countries that I mentioned, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines, in 2016, from January up to October, saw either actual attacks or attempted attacks by Islamic State-inspired fighters in Syria and Iraq. So in 2015, if you were to go and have a regional conversation about this, it would have been the fact that we're expecting a threat from the Islamic State in the near future. In 2016, that threat was immediate and already there. So this is a conversation about the here and now. It's not something that's a prospective threat for Southeast Asia. So that's the first big point, the fact that the nature of the threat is rising quite quickly despite strong state responses. I think the second big point I would make is that foreign fighters pose a manifold threat to Southeast Asian states, and only partly due to their return. And that is, another way of saying that is, these individuals don't have to return back to their countries in order to pose a threat. The main fear in Southeast Asia is that as the Islamic State loses momentum in the Middle East, given the fact that Southeast Asia has been such a big focus of Islamic State propaganda and some of the conversations around the narrative, that we could either see Southeast Asia become a rising focus in terms of a theater for local driven attacks. So more sophisticated attacks carried out in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, potentially Singapore, but that's always a little bit tougher. The United States has been involved for a key focus point. I think there's two specific manifestations. One is the actual return of these foreign fighters. Obviously, these are individuals who are going to be battle hardened. They're going to have expertise in various things like explosives making. They'll have the financing networks. They'll have international connections. But also, as I pointed out earlier, there's the difficulty of the reintegration and rehabilitation program. And this is something which Southeast Asian governments are already thinking very hard about. A good example is in Indonesia. The Turks have sent back now over 200 of these foreign fighters who have tried to get into Syria and Iraq back to Indonesia. Over 50% of these individuals, and a woman asked about children in this role earlier in the audience. More than 50% of these individuals who are sent back are actually women and children, not men. So this is a potential concern there. And then the second threat that these individuals will pose is being able to direct threats from abroad. This goes back to a point that I was making earlier. These individuals don't have to actually return home to pose a threat. They can direct some of these attacks from abroad. And this is not something which is kind of a theoretical exercise. It's already happening. A lot of the attacks that I talked about, one that happened in Indonesia last January, one that happened in Malaysia towards the summer, these have already been organized and financed by individuals who are operating from Syria and Iraq. So that's a major concern. And two of the individuals actually were last week sanctioned by the US Treasury for financing some of these operations. So the United States and the global coalition, Singapore and Malaysia are both part of the global coalition, is already starting to take note about this, and they're trying to move towards not just the military and security responses, but some of the financing stuff as well. So I'll end on that. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Prasad. I have one question I'll ask each of you, individual questions, and then we'll move it out to the audience. Haim, first question goes to you. Tunisia and France, two key countries with regard to foreign fighters, to terrorism writ large, and they have a close relationship. How do they engage one another on this threat? Obviously, of traffic between the two countries, but also Tunisians coming into Europe in other ways.
Sure, it's a complicated relationship, and it's not just between Tunisia and France, but it's between all of the Maghreb countries, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and their European allies. So it's Spain, Italy, Germany, France. They all have complicated relationships, and the foreign fighter issue and the counterterrorism cooperation intersects with migration issues, asylum issues, economic aid. So all of those issues complicate efforts to work more closely on counterterrorism, on intelligence sharing, on trying to speed up the flow of information from both. So we saw after attacks in Belgium that the Moroccan government was actually quite active in providing intelligence to Belgium and France on Moroccan suspects in Europe. And the Tunisians are trying to do the same thing. But figuring out the asylum laws, the migration issue is part of figuring out how to cooperate more closely on counterterrorism.
Thank you. Aaron, you hosted a fantastic event at your office recently, at which one of the issues discussed was the notion that ISIS, even if it is roundly and soundly defeated in Syria today, has dispatched hundreds of fighters back into Europe to set up international operations. Can you give the audience a sense of what that could look like and how the Europeans are preparing for that, maybe that bow wave following the fall of Raqqa?
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans have done a lot in the last few years to try and deal with this issue. Of course, each country has had their own approach, but there's also been an EU-level approach as well. I think one of the biggest things that's happened is that in the Scandinavian countries, they put more laws on the books. They didn't really have that as an issue. As the General said in the last panel, some countries just didn't really have any laws related to foreign fighting or joining up with terrorist groups because they never really had this type of issue in the past. But I would say the biggest advancement, which is probably something that the U.S. has lagged behind in some ways, is related to CVE in particular, you know, more of the front end and back end side of dealing with this issue, whether it's in terms of prevention and getting communities involved, or whether it's on the backside when people are trying to be rehabilitated in prison and then reintegrated back into society. And you know, one of the things that I think the Europeans have done well is that they've experimented in some ways. Of course, they failed also, but at least they're trying, which is something the U.S. isn't really doing because we like to just go at it and get 100% right away, which usually isn't possible. So, you know, some of the innovators are countries like Denmark. You hear about the Aarhus model. But the French, even though they've gotten a lot of flack in the media for many of the problems that they've had, they've tried a bunch of different things, and they're retooling and refixing things, and same with the UK as well. So I think that's one level of it. Another level is that there's been a lot more integration of information sharing between many of the European countries. What's interesting is that prior to sort of the peak and, you know, growth in this foreign fighter flow was that many of the European countries were not actually getting information on their own citizens or people traversing their own countries from other European nations. They're getting it from the U.S. So the U.S. was telling, you know, say Germany about somebody from France getting into Germany, whereas now I would say that there's a better information sharing going on within the EU countries related to the flows of individuals outside of the country, but also back in, and then from country to country. Of course, a lot easier said than done, as we've seen with some of these attacks where people have gone from one country to the next, whether to do the attack in the case of the Paris attacks in 2015, or when somebody's trying to escape and get somewhere else, such as the most recent case in Germany with Anas Amiri, when he was trying to leave Germany, and of course he eventually got killed in Italy. So I would say that those are the main aspects of what we've seen in the evolution and how the Europeans have dealt with it. But besides internally, one of the things the Europeans have done too is that through their own experiences, they've also tried to assist other nations abroad with some of these issues and learning from lessons abroad, but also bringing their own lessons to countries. And one of the cases, as you just noted, was related to whether it was Tunisia and France or Germany and Tunisia, as well as other places too.
Great, thank you. You mentioned CVE, countering violent extremism. It's a good opportunity to direct people's attention to a great CVE report that Shannon Green here at CSIS produced, a CVE commission that we hosted here, and that is available on the website. You also note the success that Denmark has seen, and I was in Aarhus recently, and I went to the Grimhøj Mosque and spoke with the police and the other folks there, and though they have smaller numbers, they have done a fantastic job of the front end, as you mentioned, CVE, but on the back end as well, when fighters come back and managing those returning fighters, and it's been quite impressive. Excellent. Prasad, back to Southeast Asia. For those fighters that do make it back, they're coming back with those skills, that credibility, as fighters in the past did when they came back from Afghanistan. I'm thinking of a number of folks who came back and joined Jamaat Islamiyah. What sort of landscape of militant groups are returning fighters looking at? What's on the menu for them to potentially rejuvenate, join, compete with? Can you give us a sense of what that landscape of fighters and groups looks like in Southeast Asia today?
Sure. I think that's very much fresh on the mind of some of these governments too. For example, if you look at the Philippines, a number of these local groups have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State already. And some of these groups are not exactly your sort of vintage typical terrorist groups. I mean, some of them are criminal groups, they're transnational crime groups. And so what you're seeing really is the potential for these individuals to return and go through a range of groups. Some of them are criminal groups, some of them are terrorist groups, some of them may be pirates. So it's kind of a broad spectrum in the Philippines. I would say in Malaysia, it's a little bit of a different landscape in the sense that the big concern for Malaysian officials is that you've seen a pattern where the Islamic State has deliberately tried to infiltrate not only the citizenry, but also the security forces. And in some cases, they've had a lot of success. Some of the airport security personnel. And so in Malaysia, there's that additional element there that I think is very concerning. And in Indonesia, it's not as much of a threat as the southern Philippines in terms of the ability for the Islamic State to get territory. But some of the groups that are operating in Sulawesi, for example, they've proven tremendously resilient. And once these individuals go back, I think Indonesia presents another case where these individuals could try to acquire some territory for some time to get some credibility. It's obviously very difficult to hold the territory once you have it, but I think that's kind of the flavor regionally is what you're looking at.
Thank you. And let me remind folks that Indonesia has just shy of 17,000 islands, the Philippines 6,500 islands. It's a lot of territory. Now, some of this is inhabited. You do need infrastructure and facilities, so it's not that you can just go to an island that's empty and then conduct your operations, but this is a huge area with a lot of islands and a lot of opportunities there. John McGaffin. Let's wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, as Tom said, John McGaffin of CSIS and other stops. I'd like to take some of you back to this is a great panel, by the way, the discussion of Libya from the following perspective, and that is of the countries that I watch, including Libya, which I've stopped going back to since they blew up my hotel the last time I was there. The internal dynamics between the competing governments and the UN government are just in Libya are making this possibility of real governance, it seems to me, in Libya is way down the path, and it seems to me to be the kind of place where ISIS, as you've said, can have a real foothold. Would you try to project with Libya and ISIS going forward, if we don't see progress towards any stability in Libya as Libya, what does it look like as a regional entity?
We've got 2 North Africa specialists among other areas that they cover. So
I can start. I mean,
with
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the political divisions within Libya have created an environment for ISIS and other jihadi Salafist groups to thrive. And until the problem of Libya's political divisions is solved, there will remain a security vacuum, a political vacuum that ISIS and other militant groups will exploit. So the problem is that ISIS has been pushed out of Sirte, but there are still elements of ISIS in the Sirte area. Many of them have migrated down to the southern part of Libya and the Fezzan. There are other jihadi Salafist groups in the eastern part of Libya as well. So the question is, do they link up with other militants in Mali? Do they try to launch cross-border operations into neighboring Tunisia and Algeria, which they've tried in the past? The positive side of that is the U.S. government and its allies have been more vigilant against ISIS with greater ISR in the region from several different countries, greater cooperation. But again, you can kill all the ISIS guys in Sirte, you can wipe out all of the jihadi Salafis in Derna, but they will go other places and continue to remain a threat until the political divisions within Libya are solved.
Yeah, I agree with that. One thing I'll add, though, is that I think we need to look at Libya separately from Iraq and Syria, even if ISIS is in Libya or was holding territory in Libya. I think many people overestimated the strength of ISIS in Libya, myself included. And I think one of the things we've seen is that while they're able to hold out and serve for some time, they didn't have as many forces or many individuals involved as some people thought originally. Another key aspect of ISIS in Libya too that I think is important to note that is different in Iraq and Syria is that a lot of the leadership of ISIS in Libya are not actually Libyans, and many of the suicide attacks were actually not done by Libyans. So I think that while they could try and take advantage of some vacuum if it opens up again in a place like Sirte, but they don't have the same kind of local support and roots as, say, ISIS does in Iraq in particular, and to a smaller extent in parts of eastern Syria. So that's one aspect, I think, where looking at the foreign fighters that joined up with ISIS in Libya and where they go next is important as well.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Yeah, I'm Aswad Jabbar from the Voice of America Kurdish Service, a writer and journalist. And I have a concern about the security service in the European country. Has I think, examining the plans to deal with thousands of returning foreign fighters coming back. I have a question about situation. It's easy coming from foreign fighter from the Europe or other countries. It's easy coming and easy go back. This question. And the other question is the radicalist and the radicalism in the Middle East, especially in the Middle East countries. It's not just the fighters. They are ideologists, radicalists, and they are the fighting against ISIS or fighting against the foreign fighters, not just fighting, my question is just not fighting the fighters. You must fighting those ideologies or those idea from behind those fighters. Yeah, thank you.
Would like to take that.
I think, in terms of the question of whether it's easier to, it's probably easier to leave Europe just because at the beginning of the conflict, many people didn't realize the magnitude or how large it was actually going to get. Whereas now there are lots of measures in place, whether it's with European countries or whether it's the relations between EU and the European countries and Turkey. So I think that one of the things we've seen is that many people that have tried to leave Syria and Iraq are now getting arrested in Turkey on their way back. That's not to say people can't sneak through the migrant and refugee flows, as I noted. It's definitely a possibility, and we've seen it. But I would say it's probably more difficult in the reverse now than it was when people were going in the first place, just because the flow of travel was a lot more open and many people weren't paying quite as much attention to it at the time.
Next question. Yes. Can you please wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. I work on North Africa at the contractor at the State Department, and I'm curious, I'm looking increasingly at the December elections in Tunisia, and I'm wondering if one of the major factors we've seen are the unmet expectations of democracy in Tunisia as fueling radicalization. In your opinion, what are potential outcomes, especially in terms of violent extremism, if the local elections are deemed unsuccessful, whether it's from low voter turnout, decreased legitimacy of the politicians, things like that?
It's a good question. The local elections in December are going to be a test of whether Tunisia is making progress on its path to toward more representative government, and whether they can boost voter turnout, especially among young people. I mean, oftentimes local elections generate more interest than national elections, where people feel that they can't really affect or influence the outcome of elections or shape policies. But on a local level, you could have more people that are invested and inspired to participate. So it's going to be a big test. For Tunisia and many other countries in the region, decentralization, giving more power to local authorities to make their own policies, decisions on everything from jobs to the environment is going to be really important. And Tunisia has a problem, as does its neighbors, in terms of getting people out to vote. And there's a growing sense in the region, not just in Tunisia, that elections don't really matter, that it's all a game that's pre-cooked. And that's a danger if that kind of enthusiasm for elections in Tunisia continues to plummet.
Tom Valentine.
Yes, Tom Valentine, Garda World Response Services. You briefly mentioned piracy. And one of the concerns I have in my business unit, I have a team of kidnap negotiators and negotiators for piracy. One of the concerns we've had is there, and this is speculative, what would happen if more hardened terrorists, ideologically based individuals come back to some of these West African, East African, and certainly in Southeast Asia, and introduce a different set of tactics, hardened approaches to piracy? Is there any anticipation of that in the academia looking at that?
So I think from the Southeast Asian perspective, governments are already thinking very hard about this. Piracy, if you look at the trajectory in Southeast Asia from the early 2000s, there was the Straits of Malacca was sort of the main playground for that. And we saw actually some very effective responses by regional states to address this problem through a series of patrols that they managed to undertake. Some of that progress has been reversed a little bit in the last year or two, but the story there is pretty good. I think the next front that countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines are now focused on is the Sulu Sea, the Sulawesi Seas. And there it's a lot more complicated because even though there's a lot of good work being done and these countries are now looking at trilateral patrols potentially, it's sensitive because there are a lot of border disputes going on between these countries that have not been resolved. And so that gets into issues such as what do you do when you have hot pursuit? Are you allowed to then chase these pirates into certain areas that other countries consider their jurisdiction? So a lot of that will, I think, have to be worked out. At the same time, as you point out, there is always a risk that criminality, piracy will intersect with the terrorism threat. And these individuals, mind you, are coming back with, as you indicated, a lot more expertise when it comes to whether it's weapons, whether it's training, battle experience. So it's a situation where, again, there's a lot of good state responses going on, but the issue is whether the returning fighter problem and also the emergence of more of these piracy threats will outstrip what these countries can do. And I'm afraid, like I said earlier, unlike the Straits of Malacca, the Sulu Sea is a very different ballgame, a very vast expanse, and a lot of these lingering disputes and challenges will take a long time to address. I think the Philippine President, Rodrigo Duterte, is very committed personally to this goal. But as we've seen, that's not always a good thing in the sense that he's very, very much ahead of the curve from the other countries that are involved. And I think it will take a long time for them to catch up to it. So some promise there, but I think a lot of challenges that need addressing. So I'd be worried about that as I have been. So.
Time, please.
I just have one point to add on that, on a much more localized, from a more localized perspective. It's really about revenue and how to generate revenue. So piracy is one where the opportunity arises. Trafficking is another that's popular and widespread in North Africa and West Africa and the Sahel. Another, smuggling more broadly, but another phenomenon that we've seen in Libya and in Algeria for a long time is an industry of kidnapping for ransom. And that's something on a more localized level could become more widespread and more threatening.
I have a bit of a wild card question I'd like to throw in there. Prashant, this is more directed towards you, but any of the panelists can answer it. 16 years ago, 15 and a half years ago, after 9/11, the Chinese were all excited that we now were on the same page that they were with their Uyghurs, with the Muslim minority in Xinjiang, and that they're signing up, and we should see the problem as the same that they have. And we, of course, said, no, this is about internal repression. But in the last few years, we have seen Uyghurs join the battle in Syria and Iraq. Tomorrow is the summit with President Trump and Xi Jinping. Do you expect President Trump to change the U.S. position on Xinjiang to any degree?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that you sort of phrased is correct in the sense that there's always a perception that when you have the threat of terrorism, even as the United States and China face a number of other challenges, that this is some kind of threat that can unify them. Mm-hmm. In spite of the fact that in the Uyghur situation, you have essentially a problem, an inherent challenge in the fact that you're right, the Uyghurs have been joining some of these groups. And together with the Rohingya, this presents a challenge in the sense that with respect to the attack in Thailand that I talked about, Uyghurs were suspected to be involved in that attack. So that's a direct consequence of that.
And they've shown up in Southeast Asia and Indonesia.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the Uyghurs, the Chinese, as you pointed out, have been famous for hyping up this threat, and that comes with a whole load of human rights and democracy issues. And I think it speaks to a broader issue in Southeast Asia, where whenever this terrorism threat comes up, on the one hand, you do have the security response and the need for these countries to step up law enforcement, but you also have the democracy and human rights problems come up. Malaysia has passed the Prevention Against Terrorism Act, POTA, the POTA. But the fear in Malaysia among human rights groups is that this is going to be used to target political opponents in Malaysia. Indonesia is looking at tougher counterterrorism laws that it needs, but some individuals are complaining already, even before the laws have been adopted and practiced, that Indonesia is going to be more along the lines of Singapore and Malaysia in this regard, where they have detention without proper trial, a holdover from sort of the British laws. And so it's a complex question. I don't expect that President Trump is going to have a significant change of line on the Uyghur issue specifically, but I do think this is an issue that will be interesting to watch because the Chinese will be looking to, on a number of levels, say, we can cooperate with the United States on some of these issues. And so what the United States does in response will be important. The Chinese, I think I'll also mention one brief point, they've also been talking to Southeast Asians about how they can help. Other things that we can do to boost your law enforcement capabilities. The Chinese see themselves as playing a bigger security role in Southeast Asia, not just the old sort of economic role and leaving the security up to the United States.
Absolutely, and they've certainly changed their relationship with the Philippines and Malaysia very recently.
Exactly.
So I think we had one question over here. Yes, this will be the last question.
Thank you. My question is in regards...
Can you say your name and your affiliation,
please?
Oh,
sure. I'm Cassandra Schneider. I'm from Creative Associates. My question is in regards to the issue of reintegration of returning foreign fighters. And I'm wondering if the panelists might offer some steps that you might recommend to governments to take to prepare for the inevitable increase in return of foreign fighters in terms of DDR.
I can start. I mean, I think the first step is figuring out what you're dealing with. So governments are trying to interview, talk with foreign fighters that have returned, as well as other radicalized individuals that are currently in prison, to figure out what motivates them. And generally are breaking them down into a couple of different categories. One are people that have committed violent crimes, that have gone to a foreign battlefield and actually used violence. The other ones are people that have been in a logistics role, and trying to figure out and separate who's been in a logistics role, maybe on social media or some other kind of non-violent role, and separating those from those who have committed violence. Then trying to separate both of those groups into people that are willing to have a dialogue with the governments and those who are not willing to change their ideology. This is a process that takes months, if not years, because generally the first series of conversations don't really lead anywhere. People's stories are not necessarily accurate. They make things up to try to hide what they've been doing. So it's really this sort of thorough investigation that governments, security forces are trying to first find out a set of facts, and then from there trying to divide individuals, and then from there trying to figure out what motivates what motivated that particular individual, and then try to address those issues. So it's about bringing in psychologists, sociologists, incorporating families and family members. This is something that the Saudis did in the 2000s in terms of bringing in relatives and tribal elements to try to sway young men that had been radicalized. So there are lots of different steps, and there are pilot programs going on.
Any final comments?
I would just add a quick comment from the Southeast Asian perspective. So there are some good sharing of practices that have been going around, particularly from Singapore and Malaysia, based on their experience. But as Haim correctly pointed out, this is a very challenging and complicated area, and the numerical success rate is often much higher than the actual practice might suggest. And as I pointed out earlier, and it's important to underscore this point, this front, reintegration and rehabilitation, has been made additionally complex by the fact that these individuals are bringing their families with them. And so you're talking about not integrating just hardened fighters, you're talking about integrating families in some of these instances. And governments are already thinking, rightly so, about intergenerational radicalization. And some of these fighters, sometimes their experiences don't surface immediately when they come back. They stay dormant, and then after a few years, and maybe after a decade or two, in the next wave that we're talking about, that's when they resurface. So that's going to be the major challenge, I think.
Excellent. Any final comments?
Yeah,
please.
just one last thing that I think is important to note is about the potential of the rise of far right-wing extremism and how that could feed into the growth in jihadism and how there could be a feedback loop between the two, especially if they gain control of certain Western European countries, and therefore there's not as much of a technocratic solution or dealing with the issue, but more of an ideological one, which could then further create this feedback loop between both the extreme jihadism and the extreme far right.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Let me close by saying I hope you folks enjoyed this, and I hope you'll visit the website foreignfighters.csis.org to see the work that we've been able to put up there. Maria, Zach, and Haim, and Margot have produced. And I'd like to encourage people to continue following the work of the three guests we have up here today because of the threat of ongoing movements of foreign fighters as they disperse, return to home countries, go on to third countries, into the Sahel region below Tunisia, into Central and Eastern Europe, as Aaron pointed out, and back to Southeast Asia and other areas, looking for new battles, something that's a cause célèbre like the Rohingyas, something like that. There's a tremendous caution here with these fighters, the skills they're bringing back, the credibility and legitimacy they have. So it's something that I think will be with us for quite some time. Let me take this moment to thank our speakers. Really appreciate your insights. Dynamite. Thank you, man.